Okay, the purpose of this next video is that I want to show how to create a basic REST API using ZIO HTTP. And to do that, I want to show how to handle different HTTP methods and also request and response data. And as I note here, I use ref to create a mock database. We've used ref before in previous videos, but just as a reminder, let me bring this over here. So ref is a purely functional, mutable reference that lets us share and update state safely and atomically across multiple ZIO fibers. So it's ideal for what we're about to do here, where we're managing simple shared state with concurrent reads and writes. The keys about ref is that operations like get, set, and update are atomic and thread safe. So again, this is just a real quick reminder of what ref is. So let me scoot that back over there. And what we're going to do here is we're going to mock up a database using a map inside of a ref right here. So I want to note that this is actually closer to a database than you might think. When you think about it, when you're working with a database, you have a database client like this, or you might have 10 or you might have 1,000 or 1,000,000 database clients trying to access a database server. And the server is what takes care of sharing and updating state safely across all of these different clients. So what I'm doing over here is just having a ref around a map, and this is a map of string and to-do elements, and that'll make more sense in just a few moments. But you could think of this part here as being a database server, or serving one table in a database, or something of an object database, and then you can have clients accessing it, and the ref takes care of sharing and updating state safely, just like a database server does. So I don't want to go too crazy with this analogy, but I did want to note that this is closer to reality than what you might think. And now if we scroll back up here, the other thing I want to note is that we're going to have curl commands to test the API, and I have those commands down here. And what we'll be doing is we'll be using our REST API. We'll add a couple of elements to our database using these post commands with curl right there. And then we can get all of the elements, we can get one element, and we can delete one element as shown in these examples. And I'll come back to all that in just a few moments once we go through the code. And the last note I had up here is that things you want to do in the real world include adding validation and adding logging. And I'll definitely get into logging in later examples. So given that background, let's start looking at the code. So we have our usual object, we give it a name here, and it extends ZIO app default. What I'm doing here is I have a case class named to-do, and it has these three fields, ID, task, and whether or not the to-do item is completed or not. In this case, I'm deriving both JSON encoder and JSON decoder because we're going to be using JSON going back and forth, as you might have seen in this area right up here. Then we have our to-do database. Again, that's a map right here inside of a ref, as I just talked about. And now what I want to do is start looking at our routes. So I've shown route definitions already. The difference here is that I'm creating routes using the def keyword. So all of these are going to be functions, and that's because each one needs to take in the database as a parameter. So this one is meant to list to-do items, takes in the database, and it returns a route of any and a response. And then you've seen this type of code here before. So this is our mapping of the route pattern over here to the handler. And now in this case, the handler is just a little bit larger, as you can see in this code right here. So the handler starts off, we have the usual request here. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to use that map method right here to transform the database get operation into a response. So again, DB here is our database. So I'm saying I want to get the map from the database. So again, the database is this ref. So I want to get this map right here. And then I want to call map on that. And when I do, I'm going to have a list of to-do elements, all of our to-dos that are stored inside the map. Right now the map is empty, but in a little while it'll have something in it. So if you can imagine that this has 10 items in it or something like that, now we have 10 to-do items. And then we say, well, if to-dos is empty, then we want to return the status of no content, which is the 204 no content. And if we call this route first, that's exactly what you'll get right there. But if we do have 10 items in the database, what we're going to do here is return a JSON response. So we'll take these to-dos, which again is a map of string and to-do elements. We'll get the values out of that, all the to-do items, create a list from that, and then create some pretty JSON from that, and we'll return that inside of this JSON response right here. So you'll see what that looks like in just a few moments. So this is a function to list all the to-do elements. This is a function to get one to-do value based on a given ID if it exists. So again, we have a function takes in the database, returns a route. This time, our route pattern goes from here to here. And you can see that this one is going to be a get on to-dos. And then we have a parameter right here, which I call ID right there. And I call it ID again here. And recall that there's not any formal relationship between this ID and this one, but I call it ID over here to be consistent. And that is a string. So this is going to be the ID that somebody is passing into us as a get parameter. And then what we do is something very similar. We call get and then map on the database. We have the to-do items right here. So we're trying to find one route is what we're trying to do. So we're saying I have this list of to-dos, which is that map. So I want to try to get out of that list something with this ID. So you can imagine that this might be element 1 right here. So if you look at that map up here, this would be element 1 right here, and it's going to have a corresponding to-do item with it. You could have element 2 here. It's going to have another to-do item, etc. So that's where this ID comes from. And basically all we're doing here is we're calling the get method on a map. So if we find something in there, in the sum case, then we're going to have one item right here, and that's going to be a to-do element. So we return that as a JSON response again, and again we use JSON pretty. For what we're doing here, I want to use JSON pretty so humans can read it. But in the real world, you probably just use toJSON right there. And when the ID is not found, when it's not a key inside the map, we'll get this none case, and again return the status of no content right there. So that's how those two functions work. The next one here is we're going to create a to-do route, and you can see the signature on this first line is pretty much the same. Here we're going to use a post method instead of a get method on this side right here. So we're going to be posting to this URI or this path name right there. And then we have the handler that goes all the way down from there down to here. So this is handling the request that we're getting in here. This one's a bit more complicated, but you can see that I'm doing it inside of a for expression. And I'm saying I want to get the body from the request, and you can see that's a string right there. And then in the second line here, we know that the body is supposed to be JSON. So what we're going to try to do is decode that JSON that we're getting into a to-do item right here. And that can fail, so that's why I'm using ZIO from either right here, is that this process right here can fail. We could get malformed JSON, or we could get anything else inside that body, so we have to be prepared for failure. So that's why we use from either right there. And then you can see over here in the success case, we will have a to-do element. We will have decoded a to-do element from that JSON. So once we have that, you can see what we're going to do is we're going to call update on our reference here and say what I want to do is I want to add this new item here. So we'll have our old map, and then we want to add this new element to that map to create a new map. So we'll have the ID from the to-do value that's being passed to us as the key, and then the actual to-do will be the value. So again, it's a key value mapping right there. And just as a note on this next line here that I have commented out, this is just the alternate syntax for this line right here. I think this line right here is a little bit easier to read, especially if you're new to working with references. Otherwise, you can use this other syntax right there. So then when we're done, when we have success, what we're going to do is we're going to yield a JSON response right there. So we're going to yield the to-do value. Again, we're going to make it pretty. And then we'll yield that with a status of status.created right there. Then if that fails, what we're going to do is we have catch-all here, and we're going to have an error, and that's going to come from this from either right here. So then what we want to do is transform that error into something that we can return. So as I've shown in previous videos, I have ZIO.succeed, and I wrap that around a JSON response, and I'm going to take that error, just convert it to a string, and return that as a JSON response. And I think that's an error right there in my code, isn't it? We're not really returning JSON here. That should just be text right there. So that was a little bug right there. So the error is just going to be a string. It's not going to be JSON. So I think that's more correct that way. And then the status here is going to be a status of a bad request. So again, they're trying to create a to-do route. And the assumption here is that they gave us some bad JSON. Maybe they gave us some malformed JSON, or maybe they gave us anything else that maybe they're trying to hack the system or something like that. So what we're going to say here is, here's the error message, and the status is going to be a bad request. And if we look at this guy right here, a bad request is going to be an HTTP 400 error, as you can see in this line of code right there. All right, so that was the create the to-do route, and then the delete a to-do route is the next one. The signature on this first line looks very similar. And then what we're doing here is the method is going to be delete. Then what we're going to do is say come to this path right here, to-dos followed by a string ID. So again, we have the string ID just like we did before. Now I'm going to call this helper function right here, which is this one right here. And this helper function here is going to take care of modifying the database. So we're saying this is our ref, or our database right there, and we want to modify our to-dos. So as usual, this is a map of string and to-do elements. And then we say on this first line here, we want to remove the to-do item from the map. So we have the list of to-dos, and we want to remove that by a key. So remember, this is a map right here, and this is the way you remove an element from an immutable map. And then this gives us a new map right here, the updated to-do elements. And then we check, okay, was anything actually deleted in that line? So that's what this was deleted means right here. That's a Boolean. And I checked the initial map to see if it actually contained that ID. So you can argue that I could refactor this code and do it in a better way. But the reality is I want to return both of these values right here. Was the element deleted? And then I want to return the updated map as a 2-element tuple. So that's what this is right here. And actually, I need to correct myself. This is a 2-element tuple, but it's inside of this modify method here, the reference modify method. So I'm returning this 2-element tuple right here to the reference modify method. And then what the ref is returning is a UIO of Boolean. So it's actually returning was deleted is what comes out of here. So recall that the way ref.modify works is the ref is going to have this new map inside of it, our new map. And then what we have here is whether or not something was deleted is going to be this Boolean value right there. So if you think about it, this is our new version of our database, and we may or may not have updated that database in this line of code, depending on whether that ID was in there or not. But regardless of that, this is the new version of our database stored inside the ref. And this is the Boolean that tells us whether or not the element was found and deleted. So that's the helper function that I call right here. And then you can see what I do with that result is I'm calling map on it. And then in the true case, I want to return a response status of no content. And I did some research on this, and this is actually a common way of handling a delete. Some people will also return a 200 code, but from what I've seen, this is the most common status to use when a delete works. And conversely, if it failed, then what we're going to return is a response. And then with the syntax that I'm using here, you can specify the body of the response. So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm saying that the body, I'm going to create the body from a string and say the to-do item with the ID $AD was not found. So I'm showing this response. I think this is the first time I've shown this syntax in these videos. So I wanted to show you this as another way you can handle things. Okay, so now that we have all those routes, you already saw this function here. What I do right here is I say I want to have a make routes function. Again, it takes in a database and it returns routes right here, routes of any response. And then I just put all of our individual routes inside that routes constructor. So now I call that make routes. And then the last part of this is our program, which is a typical for expression. So we want to make our database, and I've done this in previous videos before, but you use ref.make to make a reference. And in this case, I'm creating an empty map where the keys are string values and the values are to-do elements. So that's how we create our database right there. And then I say I want to call make routes right here, and I pass in the database to it, and that's what's coming in right up here. And then we call server.serve on our app right there. So again, app is just a series of routes. So I could call this routes, and then I could call that routes. As I mentioned before, I prefer that name, but what you'll see in the documentation is that's called app. But I prefer routes, so I'm going to use that today. And then everything down here is definitely what you've seen before. So we create a server configuration there. And then a run values is program.provide. And we're going to provide the server configuration right here. And then we'll use the server.live. So all of this is things that you've seen before in previous videos. So given all that background, all we have to do now is test our code.